Hello and welcome to part 2. Today we'll be talking about following the instructions and cutting sprues. We'll start off where we left off, on step number 1. You will also see that step 1 is broken into 2 subgroups, A and B. These are referenced in step 1 on the left. Typically, subgroups are to be done first, despite ordering on the page. Depending on the manufacturer though, these may be presented in different ways, step A, subgroup 1 and 2, so on. This is typically explained in the instructions, but not always, so remember, read through carefully before taking any action. I think the biggest lesson is patience and practice. Things will go wrong at any point, and it can be frustrating, but learning from mistakes is how we grow. We know from these instructions we need parts A3, A4, A17 and A41 for subgroup A, which seems a reasonable place to start. To help remember where you are, I always advise doing one part in its entirety first. This is slower, but it helps avoid getting muddled up on what part you're doing. So the tools of the trade. We'll start at the beginning. You need to get the parts from the sprues. There are a few ways you can do this. Firstly, the way I do it are dedicated sprue cutters. These are my Tamiya pair. And they were good, but unfortunately I use them to cut things that you aren't meant to. As such, they have chips in the blade that makes them not work so well. So if you go this route, only use them as intended on plastic. The pros are, when they're looked after, they do their job fantastically well. But it's an extra cost and this tool should only do one job. What you're looking for in a pair of side cutters is a sharp, low profile blade. This helps it get into tight spots and cut through the plastic with minimal effort. And you want to use the very tip of the cutters, as the more thicker parts of the cutter means it will push more plastic out of the way while cutting, which in turn means smaller or more fragile parts could and probably will snap. With side cutters we want to cut with the flat side towards the part as close as we can get. Now right here you'll see, as close to the part as we have cut, there are still tabs, I guess they would be called. No matter how well you do at cutting the part out, it's very likely that these will always remain. We'll come to sorting these out shortly. The next tool you can use is a scalpel. The pros are, it's a very versatile, very cheap tool, one that I would recommend having in your model making arsenal anyway. The cons are, it's very dangerous. Now what I recommend is finding an amazingly sharp set of blades, that way you won't have to put too much pressure on the blade. The less pressure you put on the blade, the less likely it is to slip. This is a very important thing to note. If you're putting a lot of energy into cutting something, and it suddenly gives, you have lost control of that blade, and that's when it's dangerous. I would also recommend never cutting towards yourself. I tell people that as many times as I have scars on my hands. When using a knife to cut things off sprues, lightly place the blade where you want it to be cut and gently reciprocate backwards and forwards, like sawing a piece of wood. If the blade is sharp enough, this should only take a few goes to cut through. If your knife beds in the cutting surface, you've probably pressed a bit too hard. The most important lesson I can give while using anything sharp is use adult supervision if you need it. I cannot stress enough how dangerous these things can be if used improperly. The third option is a razor saw. A razor saw is kind of halfway between a scalpel and a pair of side cutters on a price to usefulness chart. It has more uses than a pair of side cutters, but unlike a scalpel, these uses are for more advanced techniques, so you may not have any other uses for them until you become more experienced and want to do more out there things. A benefit of razor saws is that they are relatively safe. Though they have razor in the name, they are typically not sharp. At least I've never had a sharp pair. Their cutting ability comes from the teeth on the saw. Much like the knife, you use these in a reciprocating fashion, almost exactly like a wood saw. Some cons of using this tool to cut sprues is that A, you need to be careful as to not damage all the model parts. It's a relatively big tool that you need to drag across the sprues and you will likely get close to other parts. One false move and you've put a big scratch across another part. And B, it takes some getting used to moving your arm in a perfectly straight line where the blade is. Similar to playing pool or snooker. If you mess it up, you can bend some of the thinner blades, making them useless. Sometimes I'll use different combinations of techniques, as sometimes they require different tools. For example, If a model has resin parts, I will use a razor saw first. That's because resin parts are typically quite brittle, and the use of side cutters will snap the piece in half, and a scalpel will just not cut through the part as it's too tough. Photo etch parts are usually too small to be side cut, and a razor saw will not cut through it, so a scalpel specifically for these parts is used. It should be noted that you should always do any cutting down onto a dedicated cutting surface. Basically, not on a surface you don't want to be scratched, like a dining table. Something reasonably thick, tissue paper won't stop blades from scratching whatever is underneath it. Something like a chopping board, while good, will likely be too hard and damage any cutting edges. I recommend a dedicated cutting mat. They are worth the money in the long run, as they will last for years with proper care. With that, I will fast forward the footage until the next thing of note. So, the first casualty of the build. Despite how careful I have been, unfortunately this part decided to give up the ghost, so this will be a nice learning point which we will delve into on a future episode. You may have also noticed I have started cutting pieces off for subgroup B, against the advice I gave earlier for doing one part at a time. However, in doing this I made sure to keep the parts separate. Though they look similar, often there can be small differences that mean the parts are not interchangeable, so you don't want to mix them up. Today we've done a pretty good job of covering the fundamentals of getting the parts from their little plastic prisons. I hope you'll join me for the next episode.